The humid Bamako night clung to the red dust streets of Mali's capital, a city where the threat of kidnappings and terrorist attacks was as constant as the heat. Inside a secure residence meant for America's most elite warriors, a cold war was brewing between men who were supposed to be brothers in arms. Army Staff Sergeant Logan J. Melgar, a Green Beret with 2 tours in Afghanistan under his belt, was a man who lived by a strict code. He was quiet, professional, and deeply focused on the counter-terrorism mission against al-Qaeda-affiliated groups. His fellow soldiers in the 3rd Special Forces Group knew him as a dedicated husband to his wife, Michelle, and a man who took his responsibilities seriously. However, the house he shared with 2 Navy SEALs from the legendary counterterrorism unit known as SEAL Team 6, Chief Petty Officer Adam C. Matthews and Petty Officer First Class Anthony E. Didolph, was becoming a source of daily frustration. Didolph, and a former professional mixed martial arts fighter and a Purple Heart recipient, alongside Matthews, represented a culture that clashed violently with Melgar's discipline. Where Melgar saw a deployment as a sacred duty, he saw the SEALs engaging in what he described as juvenile behavior. The tension was palpable and revolved around accusations that cut to the heart of operational security. Melgar was deeply troubled by what he witnessed, allegedly accusing the SEALs of bringing prostitutes back to the residence, a breach of conduct that could compromise the entire mission and expose them to enemy intelligence. In desperate messages to his wife, Michelle, he poured out his anger, typing words that would later haunt investigators. "I freaking hate them." The SEALs, in turn, viewed Melgar as an outsider who didn't fit their mold. They actively worked to marginalize him, banning him and another Special Forces soldier from their operations center, a move that isolated the Green Beret within his own living quarters. 2 Marine Raiders, Gunnery Sergeant Mario Madera Rodriguez and Staff Sergeant Kevin Maxwell, were also stationed nearby, often joining the SEALs on their excursions into the city. The fuse for the explosion that would destroy them all had been lit, and it was slowly burning through the fabric of the special operations community in Bamako. And the quiet professionalism of Logan Melgar was a stark contrast to the reckless behavior he saw around him, and that contrast was about to prove fatal. The evening of June 3rd, 2017, began like many others in the expatriate social scene of Bamako. An invitation had been extended for a party at the French embassy, a rare taste of high-class society in a city otherwise defined by its security perimeters and restrictions on alcohol consumption under General Order No. 1. Logan Melgar saw the event as a legitimate engagement and drove himself toward the embassy. Following behind him in another vehicle were the 2 Marine Raiders, Madera Rodriguez and Maxwell, alongside the 2 Navy SEALs, Matthews and Didolph. As they navigated the chaotic traffic of Bamako, Melgar's vehicle pulled ahead and eventually disappeared from view. To the men in the trailing car, this was not a matter of traffic logistics. It was a personal insult. They became convinced that Melgar had deliberately ditched them, a sign of disrespect that demanded retribution. Instead of proceeding to the embassy, the 4 men diverted their course. They ended up at a local bar called the Appaloosa, a Western-themed establishment that served as a gathering spot for expatriates and aid workers. Over beers and whiskey, the initial frustration curdled into something darker. They discussed their grievances with Melgar and Didolph, and the former MMA fighter with a killer's instincts began to formulate a plan. It was to be a lesson, a hazing designed to humiliate the Green Beret and put him back in his place. The plan was crude and violent. They would break into Melgar's room in the middle of the night, put him in a chokehold until he was subdued, and then duct tape him. The ultimate goal was to create a degrading tableau. They intended to strip Melgar, bring in one of the Malian security guards, put a belt around the guard's neck like a leash, and force him into a compromising position with the unconscious soldier. They would then photograph and film the scene, creating a stockpile of blackmail material to ensure Melgar's future compliance. They even gave the operation a lewd and juvenile code name, Operation Tossed Salad. Later, the group moved to the Byblos nightclub, continuing to drink and solidify their resolve. At some point, they stopped at the Marines' residence to gather supplies, a sledgehammer, and several rolls of duct tape. As the clock ticked past 4 a.m. on June 4th, the four men, along with a confused and likely coerced Malian guard, converged on the quiet Army-Navy house where Melgar slept, oblivious to the nightmare that was about to descend upon him. In the pre-dawn darkness, the four men lined up outside Melgar's bedroom door. The air was thick with the smell of alcohol and adrenaline. And Madera Rodriguez hefted the sledgehammer, his role in the plan to provide the soundtrack for the assault by playing loud music from his phone, a bizarre and cruel detail that prosecutors would later seize upon. At approximately 5:25 a.m., the sledgehammer came down on the door, splintering the frame and creating a thunderous crash designed to shock Melgar awake in a state of utter confusion and terror. They surged into the room. Maxwell ripped back the mosquito netting around the bed. Dodolphe, the trained fighter, launched himself at the sleeping soldier, immediately locking him in a vicious chokehold. Melgar, a Green Beret who had faced the Taliban, did not go quietly. Despite being ambushed in his sleep, he fought back with everything he had, struggling against the overwhelming force of the four men. Matthews grabbed his legs while the Marines tried to secure his limbs with the duct tape. The struggle was intense, desperate, and chaotic. Yet Melgar was forced face down onto the bed, Dodolphe's arm wrapped around his neck, cutting off his airway. As the men worked to bind his wrists, the room fell silent. The struggling stopped. They rolled him over and saw his face. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. The red-tinted spittle that later came from his mouth during the frantic rescue attempts would tell the story of asphyxiation. The hazing had gone horribly, fatally wrong. Panic instantly replaced the bravado. They cut the tape away and tried to perform CPR. Matthews, his hands covered in blood, attempted rescue breaths. In a scene of sheer desperation, they even attempted a field-expedient tracheotomy, trying to cut a hole in Melgar's throat to allow air into his lungs. It was useless. Logan Melgar was dead, killed by the very people sent to protect America's interests alongside him. Realizing the horror of what they had done, the instinct for self-preservation kicked in with the precision of a military operation. They loaded Melgar's body into a vehicle and drove him to a nearby medical clinic where he was officially pronounced dead. But even as they drove, the cover-up was already being scripted. In the immediate aftermath of Melgar's death, the four men scrambled to control the narrative. The initial story, concocted in those first panicked moments, was a clumsy lie. Dodolphe and Melgar had been practicing hand-to-hand combat drills, a wrestling match that had gone terribly wrong. They speculated that perhaps Melgar had been drinking, implying it was his fault. The two SEALs, Matthews and Dodolphe, took the lead. They told the Marines that they would handle this. They were the tip of the spear, the mythic SEAL Team 6 operators, and they believed their status would protect them. And they assured Madera Rodriguez and Maxwell that they would be left out of the story, that the SEALs would take the heat. The cover-up was almost immediate and involved a shocking breach of protocol. Scott Patterson, an assistant regional security officer from the U.S. State Department, arrived to secure the scene. Unaware of the Marines' involvement, he entered Melgar's bedroom accompanied by none other than Madera Rodriguez, who served as a witness to the scene he had helped create. Meanwhile, another soldier, aware of the alcohol consumed in violation of General Order No. 1, directed one of the Marines to scour the house and dispose of all the liquor, fearing it would compound their problems. When Jason Willis, the regional security officer, arrived at the clinic, he found a chaotic scene. Matthews was standing there shirtless, his hands caked in blood. Didolf was pacing erratically, in a state of shock, repeating himself, and not lucid, yet still clinging to the wrestling story. For a week, the lie held. On June 11, 2017, Madera, Rodriguez, and Maxwell even accompanied Army criminal investigators back to the crime scene, walking them through the fake scenario of the friendly wrestling match, pointing out where they claimed Didolf had practiced his holds. They played the role of helpful colleagues, all while hiding the truth about the sledgehammer, the duct tape, and the planned humiliation. But they had made mistakes. In their rush to cover up, they had overlooked crucial evidence. Investigators, sifting through the room, found a small but damning piece of proof. Under Melgar's bed, stained with his blood, was a piece of duct tape. The discovery of the duct tape was the first crack in the wall of silence. Investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, knew immediately that this was no simple wrestling accident. They began digging deeper, interviewing everyone connected to the case. They soon found Jennifer Brown, a female friend of Madera Rodriguez, who had been drinking with the men at the Appaloosa bar and the Byblos nightclub on the night of June 3rd. Brown, who worked for the U.S. government in Mali, had overheard the planning. She told investigators exactly what the men had intended to do to Melgar, revealing the premeditation behind the deadly assault. With a witness and physical evidence contradicting their story, the elaborate cover-up began to disintegrate. Cell phone records and text messages corroborated Brown's account, showing the men's movements from the bar to the restaurant, to the Marine House to pick up the sledgehammer and duct tape at approximately 4 a.m., and finally to the Army-Navy House for the attack between 5:25 and 5:35 a.m. The timeline was a devastating indictment of their premeditation. Faced with mounting evidence, the Brotherhood of the Elite began to fracture. Now, the first to break was Marine Staff Sergeant Kevin Maxwell. In June 2019, he pleaded guilty to charges of negligent homicide, conspiracy, hazing, and obstruction of justice. As part of his plea, he provided a detailed account of the events, confirming the plan to haze and humiliate Melgar. Shortly after, Navy SEAL Chief Adam Matthews also struck a deal, pleading guilty to conspiracy and related charges. In his stipulation of fact, he provided a chilling clinical description of the assault, and including the horrifying detail of seeing red-tinted spittle from Melgar's mouth hit his face as he tried to revive him. Then, in January 2021, the other SEAL, Anthony Didolf, the man whose chokehold had actually killed Logan Melgar, pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. One by one, they turned on each other, their stories aligning to reveal the truth, leaving Marine Gunnery Sergeant Mario Madera Rodriguez, the man who swung the sledgehammer, as the last man standing, heading for a court-martial where his former comrades would now testify against him. As the court-martial of Marine Gunnery Sergeant Mario Madera Rodriguez commenced in the summer of 2021, the full weight of the prosecution's case landed on the jury. The courtroom at Naval Station Norfolk heard the devastating opening statement from Marine Captain Jason Samuel, who painted a picture of a premeditated ambush fueled by alcohol and petty resentment. He described Madera Rodriguez's role in stark terms. He broke into that room and provided the soundtrack to Staff Sergeant Melgar's strangulation. The defense's opening, however, was shrouded in secrecy, held behind closed doors due to the presence of classified information, a procedural twist that underscored the murky world these men inhabited. The trial peeled back the layers of the cover-up and revealed the toxic culture that had festered in the Bamako residence. Witness after witness took the stand, many of them the accused themselves, bound by their plea deals to tell the truth. The testimony of Maxwell, Matthews, and Didolf laid bare the planning, the execution, and the panicked cover-up. The prosecution argued that Madera Rodriguez was not a passive participant, but an integral part of the conspiracy. The defense presumably argued that he was following the lead of the more senior SEALs. or that the death was a tragic accident never intended by any of them. The evidence was overwhelming: the pre-planning at the bar, the acquisition of the sledgehammer and tape, the forced entry, the assault, and the coordinated lying that followed. The 8-member, all-male jury of Marines and sailors listened to the grim details of how a Green Beret, a man who had volunteered to serve his country in its most dangerous theaters, was killed in his bed by his own comrades over a perceived slight in traffic. The prosecution hammered home the point that this was not a prank gone wrong, but a felony murder committed during the course of a burglary and assault. The question for the jury was not just what happened, but who bore the ultimate responsibility for the chain of events that Madera Rodriguez had helped set in motion when he picked up that sledgehammer. The verdict, when it came, was a sobering conclusion to a saga that had tarnished the reputation of the entire Special Operations community. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Mario Madera Rodriguez was found guilty on multiple charges, including felony murder. The conviction affirmed the prosecution's theory that the death of Logan Melgar, even if unintended, was a direct result of a violent, premeditated felony. The man who had smashed down the door and provided the soundtrack to the strangulation was held accountable for the deadly symphony. He faced the possibility of life in prison without parole, a sentence that reflected the gravity of betraying a fellow soldier in the middle of the night. The other 3 men, Dadolph, Matthews, and Maxwell, faced the consequences of their actions as well, receiving prison sentences and dishonorable or bad conduct discharges that stripped them of the honor and status they had once held. The case sent shockwaves through the military, raising hard questions about discipline, culture, and leadership within the most elite units. It exposed a dark underbelly of hazing, alcohol abuse, and a sense of invincibility that had led 4 men to treat a fellow warrior as an enemy to be subdued. For the family of Logan Melgar, particularly his wife Michelle, who had read his angry messages about the SEALs and knew the depth of his frustration, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never bring him back. The story of what happened in that small room in Bamako became a permanent, tragic chapter in the annals of modern warfare, a cautionary tale about how the bonds of brotherhood can be shattered by arrogance, alcohol, and a moment of unimaginable stupidity and violence.